Tom Fitton runs Judicial Watch, as you well know, because he's a frequent guest on this show. He's been watching all of this, and he joins us tonight. What's the takeaway for you, Tom?
Well, it's a terrible day for the Constitution of the country. The president has been terribly abused. Our Constitution's being attacked. And, you know, taking a step back, we have information that the United States government, more or less, was lying to us for 3 years about Russia collusion.
And by the way, about Afghanistan and UFOs and fill in the blanks, the food pyramid. Right. I mean, do you know what I mean? Like all the things we're not talking about.
Right,
yeah.
But the lies were designed to put this man in jail.
Yes.
And he's been completely exonerated and vindicated. And he was started asking questions about what went on in Ukraine as it was related to that. And now the same gang that lied about him and tried to put him in jail illegally is now impeaching him for asking questions about it. And impeaching him for defending himself in response to their obsessive activities with regard to trying to get his people to testify.
Obsessive is right.
With today's illegal, unconstitutional, and partisan impeachment, the do-nothing Democrats, and they are do-nothing. All they want to do is focus on this. What they could be doing are declaring their deep hatred and disdain for the American voter. This lawless partisan impeachment is a political suicide march for the Democrat Party. Have you seen my polls in the last 4 weeks? It's crazy.
We are now in a new, more open phase of this impeachment investigation. After weeks of questioning behind closed doors here on the Hill, we are now seeing the first witness transcripts out in the open, and they are painting a turbulent picture of shadow diplomacy.
Just so you understand, it's the single greatest witch hunt in American history, probably in history, but in American history. It's a disgraceful thing. The letter was a great letter, meaning the letter revealing the call. That was done at the insistence of myself and other people that read it.
Article 1 is adopted. Article 2 is adopted.
We do have breaking news tonight, a deeply divided moment playing out in American history as we come on the air. President Trump has just been impeached on both Article 1, abuse of power, and on Article 2, obstruction of Congress. The vote.
And with that, Donald Trump going down in American history as the third U.S. president to be impeached, with a vote Wednesday night almost exclusively along party lines in the Democrat-controlled House.
That means President Trump, no matter how much he objects, will forever be known as the third American president to ever be impeached.
President Trump has just been impeached on both Article 1, abuse of power, and on Article 2, obstruction of Congress.
Donald Trump going down in American history as the third U.S. president to be impeached.
President Trump has just been impeached.
President Trump, no matter how much he objects, will forever be known as the third American president to ever be impeached. Donald Trump going down in American history as the third U.S. president to be impeached, 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 impeached.
So, what's the verdict? Did he do it or not? Oh, he totally did it. And just like with the collusion narrative, there's so many nasty little gross details that, of course, once again illustrate that Donald Trump and everyone around him are extremely corrupt liars who deserve far more than mere impeachment. But don't just take my word for it. Let's look at the actual evidence, shall we?
We also now know the name of the whistleblower.
I say tonight
to the media, do your job and print his name.
The whistleblower's identity has not been revealed.
Oh, so you mean he just literally lied?
His or her lawyer said any member of Congress who tries to out the whistleblower is a disgrace. In the crowd, some Trump supporters donned T-shirts that said, "Read the transcript," a reference to the president's July phone call with the Ukrainian president.
My phone call was perfecto.
Mr. Trump insists the call was perfect. But in newly released testimony, former Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch says she felt threatened when she learned that the president called her bad news and warned she was going to go through some things.
This is someone who served the country with distinction for decades. It is someone who also is one of the first witnesses to this irregular back channel that the president established with Rudy Giuliani.
Yovanovitch also told lawmakers she was warned by Ukrainian officials last winter to watch her back because the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, was planning to do things, including to her.
She got fired finally.
Giuliani apparently viewed Ambassador Yovanovitch as an impediment to his efforts to get Ukraine to investigate President Trump's potential rival, Joe Biden.
Yeah, whatever. That's fake news. Read the transcript. It was a perfect call. A perfect call, I tell you. Yeah, well, you're right. Maybe we should look at the transcript.
It started out like a typical phone call between two world leaders.
Congratulations on a great victory.
Earlier in the year, Vladimir Zelensky defeated the incumbent to become president of Ukraine, and now his political party had won a majority in parliament.
We all watched from the United States, and you did a terrific job.
I would like to confess to you that I had an opportunity to learn from you. We used quite a few of your skills and knowledge.
But minutes later, this conversation took a turn with a single line from Trump.
I would like you to do us a favor, though.
What Trump said next, according to a rough transcript released by the White House, forms the core of the impeachment proceedings against him. This 30-minute phone call might become one of the most important moments in American history. Let's back up a month before the call. Congress had approved $391 million in military aid to Ukraine to help them defend against Russia. But Trump told his staff to withhold that money. He wanted to talk to Zelensky first.
Congratulations on a great victory.
After sharing pleasantries, Trump quickly changed the subject. He alluded to the billions of dollars in military aid the U.S. has given Ukraine in the last few years.
The United States has been very, very good to Ukraine. I wouldn't say that it's reciprocal necessarily, because things are happening that are not good. But the United States has been very, very good to Ukraine.
I wouldn't say it's reciprocal. In other words, Ukraine owed him something.
Yes, you are absolutely right.
Zelensky then told Trump he's ready to cooperate.
We're ready to continue to cooperate for the next steps.
I would like you to do us a favor, though.
Trump ran through a few requests, and then he got to this one.
There's a lot of talk about Biden's son.
Let's pause here. At the time of the call, Joe Biden was the leading candidate to run against Trump in 2020. Polls from just before the call show voters preferred Biden to Trump by a wide margin. When he picked up the phone to call Zelensky, Joe Biden was a huge threat to Trump's re-election. That's why what he said next is so important.
Whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. If you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me.
Trump has this theory about Joe Biden, and it has to do with his son, Hunter. Back in 2014, Hunter took a cushy job at a Ukrainian gas company, Burisma. As it turns out, the British were investigating the owner of that same company for money laundering, and they asked Ukraine's top prosecutor, Viktor Shokin, to pursue this case, because investigating corruption was his job. But Shokin ignored them, and Burisma's owner was never prosecuted. It wasn't the first time Shokin had failed to investigate corruption, and people in Ukraine were fed up.
Activists, MPs, and ordinary citizens have come together to demand the resignation of the Prosecutor General, Viktor Shokin.
We don't believe even that this prosecution can be reformed, because it doesn't exist.
They weren't alone. 8 senators, including 3 Republicans, signed a letter calling for urgent reforms in the Prosecutor General's office. Basically, a bunch of people were pushing for Shokin to go, including the Obama administration, who sent Biden to deal with it.
And I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired.
Ukraine's embattled Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin is no longer in office.
But in the call with the Ukrainian president, Trump hinted that Shokin was fired for a different reason.
I heard you had a prosecutor who was very good, and he was shut down, and that's really unfair.
Then Trump explained why he thought Joe Biden might have been behind Shokin's dismissal.
There's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me.
Alright, so what's the favor Trump is asking for here? It looks like he's asking Zelensky for some proof that Joe Biden pushed to get Shokin fired to protect Hunter. Which doesn't even make sense because Shokin was fired in part for not investigating Burisma. But if Zelensky could help Trump make it look like Biden had done something shady, it could help Trump win re-election. Zelensky agreed. He promised his next prosecutor would look into the situation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bye-bye.
Several staffers listened in on this phone call and wrote down what he said. That's normal. What's not normal is what happened next. Instead of putting the records of the call in the normal archive where more people within the US government would have been able to see it, Trump's staffers hid the transcript in a computer system reserved for classified material, even though the call had no reason to be classified. Multiple White House officials were worried that the president had crossed the line, and they told a CIA officer who wrote to Congress, "I have received information from multiple US government officials that the President of the United States is using the power of his office to solicit interference from a foreign country in the 2020 US election." Meanwhile, a few weeks later, Trump released the $391 million in aid to Ukraine.
Two former top members of the Trump campaign now under house arrest.
There have been many Trump scandals.
The president welcomed Russian interference and lied about it.
There is at least the suggestion and strong evidence of obstruction of justice.
What's different about this is it's so simple. President Trump directly asked a foreign leader to investigate his political opponent and influence the 2020 election. Then his staff tried to cover it up. It's a simple phone call, but it could show that Trump is abusing the office of the president in an effort to hold on to power. And it could end his presidency, if enough members of Congress believe it should.
You've been in politics for quite some time. How does this rank as far as on the outlandish scale for you the last 48 hours watching this transpire?
18 out of 10.
Mm-hmm.
No, this is kind of bizarre, and it's Rudy Giuliani is a great character witness the president has.
Mm-hmm.
And,
it's hard to believe he was mayor of New York at one time and seemed to be doing an okay job. I mean, it's like his body has been taken over by another being.
I didn't know the president could do that.
Maybe he's more powerful than we realize. It is almost like you and President Obama left the door to the White House open and a bear got in. It is... it's crazy.
Okay, Jimmy, that's enough. Let's be serious here.
Is there a gossip element to this sort of thing, or is it just trouble you?
Look, it's when you step back from it, this is not about me and my family. There's not one single solitary legitimate journalist in the world who's given any credibility to this. They've debunked all of what he's had to say for the past, since Giuliani started this a while ago. But what I do worry about is I do worry about all the other families that can't take care of themselves and what's happening with this president and his constant diversions into, look, we want to get his attention, have 70 polls in a row showing you beating him. And that all of a sudden gets his attention. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's why I'm the object of his attention. But look, there's much more at stake than whether or not he's acting so bizarrely. This is the idea that someone would call a head of a foreign state ahead of time, withhold significant military aid that's badly needed in order to prevent the Russian separatists who are in Ukraine from taking over Ukraine, and then ask basically can you cooperate with Rudy Giuliani? He's coming over, and the thing we all learned recently is that statement that the 2,000-word statement released was that talked about getting the Justice Department engaged in this. I mean, it's such a blatant abuse of power that it just I don't think it can stand.
Yeah, do you think it is an impeachable, this particular instance is an impeachable offense?
Based on the material that they acknowledge today, it seems to me it's awful hard to avoid the conclusion that it is an impeachable offense and a violation of constitutional responsibility. But even then, I hadn't planned on running until I saw those people. Not a joke, Jimmy. When I saw those folks in Charlottesville coming out of the fields carrying torches, contorted faces, their veins bulging, shouting the same anti-Semitic bile that was shouted in the streets of Nuremberg and Berlin and throughout Germany in the 30s, accompanied by the Ku Klux Klan. And when the president was asked, when a young woman was killed, asked to respond, he said, well, there were very fine people in both groups.
You also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
That were very fine people on both sides.
This city is run by Jewish communists and criminal niggers. 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 Jewish communists and criminal niggers.
Jewish communists and criminal niggers. Jewish communists and criminal niggers.
No president has ever said anything like that, with the possible exception of Andrew Jackson before the Civil War. And that's when I decided, how can I've spent my whole life doing this, how can I remain silent? Because I was raised by a dad who taught me silence is complicity. This is the way that he's tried to divide this country and the way he has pitted people against one another. And you saw it didn't just end with Charlottesville. Look what happened in El Paso recently. A young man saying, I shot all these people in the parking lot because there's a Hispanic invasion. Well, the president we had in the 2018 off-year campaign, kept showing that video of people marching up. We're being invaded by Latinos and Mexican or rapists. And
they're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists.
He's a Mexican. We're building a wall between here and Mexico.
Can anyone, please explain to me how the hell the President of the United States saying Democrats are the problem, they don't care about crime, and want illegal immigrants, no matter how bad they may be, to pour into and infest our country? I mean, are you freaking kidding me? Are you out of your minds? How can anyone in their right mind say that doesn't further divide the country while also encourage actual racists to commit crimes and or mass murder? Like, how can anyone possibly argue against that? How can any moral person possibly condone our world leader saying something like this? Even this one single thing is enough. And see, that's what we find so morally reprehensible about both Trump and now all of you, that any one of the literally hundreds of things Trump has said and done just since taking office are enough proof to remove our support, let alone all of it combined. How can anyone vote for a human being that's this abhorrent and still have the gall to call themselves a moral person? And these are just two examples, okay? So I don't care if you're Republican, I don't care if you're Democrat, I don't care if you're liberal or conservative or independent or libertarian or Green Party or blue party or purple party. This shouldn't be morally acceptable to anyone. If you're serious about politics or the country or the government in any way, none of this should be acceptable to anyone. There is no excuse.
And this division in our country is just so devastating for so many people. And it's ruining our standing around the world in a way that is going to be hard to replace. Look, we can probably handle 4 years if he doesn't get us in a war in the next year. And I'm not being a wise guy. I'm not being glib saying that. But 8 years of Donald Trump will fundamentally alter the character of this nation, in my view. And, we can't let that happen.
Do you know most people think that impeachment means you're out of office? Did you ever get that feeling, or are you just in the bubble here? They think that you get impeached, you're gone. And that is completely not true. It's not the means to the end that people think. All you do, vote to impeach, bye-bye birdie. It isn't that.
Nailed it. I mean, Nancy Pelosi knows there's simply no better way to connect with the average working Joe than by referencing a Broadway musical from 1960. The fact that, as Nancy Pelosi just said, impeachment in no way guarantees a president's removal from office. In fact, no president has ever actually been removed through this process. 2 presidents have been impeached, Clinton and Johnson, but remained in office, and Nixon actually resigned on his own before the House could finish impeaching him. Sort of like an Irish goodbye if Nixon didn't also hate the Irish. Very basically, here is how the impeachment process works. Typically, it begins with an inquiry in the House of Representatives, during which a committee investigates and holds hearings into a president's conduct. And if a majority decides they found impeachable offences, they vote to impeach. But that is not the end. That merely moves the process to the Senate, where a trial is held. And the president is only removed from office if a 2/3 majority votes for that. So, what is the case for putting this president through that process? Well, the Constitution says grounds for impeachment are treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. And that last phrase can trip people up, even people who might really want to research its exact definition.
There was no crime. You know, it's high crimes and, not with or. It's high crimes and misdemeanors. There was no high crime and there was no misdemeanor. So how do you impeach based on that?
Okay, clearly, high crimes and misdemeanors doesn't literally mean there has to be both a big crime and a little crime. Oh, well, the president's committed murder, now we just need to catch him urinating on the side of a Wawa and we got him. No, that's not how anything works. Because the fact is, high crimes and misdemeanors can include acts that are not actual crimes. It is a broad term for serious misconduct. McGahn's appearance in the Mueller report got a lot of attention when it first came out, primarily because of one eye-catching quote.
Former White House counsel Don McGahn, he refused to ask Rod Rosenstein to fire Mueller and threatened to resign instead after the president asked him to do, quote, crazy, using a word that I can't use on TV.
The word is shit. The word in question is shit. Don McGahn said the president, and I quote, asked him to do crazy shit. And it's frankly amazing that in a time when norms are crumbling left and right, we're upholding the norm that Ali Velshi can't say shit on MSNBC. That phrase, crazy shit, actually became unhelpfully distracting because the fact the president's lawyer said a naughty word kept people from focusing on the details of what Trump actually asked him to do, which many argue amounted to flagrant obstruction. Trump asked McGahn to have Robert Mueller, the person investigating him, fired. Specifically, according to McGahn, under oath, Trump told him Mueller has to go, adding, call me back when you do it, then calling him back and asking, have you done it? So this is clearly something very important to Trump. It wasn't something he said casually, like Robert Pattinson should not take back Kristen Stewart, she cheated on him like a dog, or my favourite part of Pulp Fiction is when Sam has his gun out in the diner and he tells the guy to tell his girlfriend to shut up. Tell that bitch to be cool, say bitch be cool. I love those lines. No, this was something Trump was really serious about. But the potential obstruction didn't stop there, because a second instance Mueller cited came after news broke that Trump had tried to remove Mueller. And Trump tried to get McGahn to put out a statement denying it, and also said he wanted McGahn to write a letter to that effect for our records. So, to recap there, it seems the president obstructed justice, then obstructed justice again to try to obstruct the investigation into his obstruction of justice. It's ridiculous. I know that this might seem like a legal technicality and a couple of phone calls that didn't go anywhere, but here's why this really matters. But for Don McGahn, Trump might have stopped an investigation into himself. And if a president can shut down an investigation, he can basically do anything with no consequences. It's a big deal. The problem is, this has been in the public record for nearly 2 months now and has failed to make much of an impression. When Justin Amash, the only House Republican to come out in favour of impeachment so far, held a town hall where he explained his decision, at least one of his attendees was genuinely shocked to hear that Trump might have done anything wrong.
I was surprised to hear there was anything negative in the Mueller report at all about President Trump. I hadn't heard that before, and I mainly listened to conservative news, and I hadn't heard anything negative about that report, and President Trump had been exonerated.
Yeah, that's what'll happen when you mainly listen to conservative news. It's like if your only source of information about O.J. Simpson is his new Twitter account. But that woman is by no means alone. The truth is, most people are simply never going to read a 448-page legal document. That is presumably why Congress has been trying to have public hearings, to get that information out in a way that might resonate with people better. In fact, McGahn was called to publicly testify last month, which could have been very powerful. And I'm guessing that's why this happened instead.
Former White House counsel Don McGahn was a no-show at a House hearing today after the president insisted he not testify.
Democrats had hoped to hear from former White House counsel Don McGahn. Instead, they were faced with this empty chair.
Great. So Democrats tried to have a hearing, but instead had Passover. They put out a chair for a guest who didn't arrive, and most of America had no idea that it happened. And look, there is a real argument to be made here for concentrating Congress's investigations and the public's attention into one impeachment inquiry. So why not do it? Well, Nancy Pelosi might argue that impeachment is not popular with the public, which is, to be fair, true. Polls consistently show a majority of Americans oppose impeachment proceedings, although it is not quite that simple. Remember, most people don't even know what is in the Mueller report, and numbers can move as people learn more. Look at Nixon. In hindsight, his resignation seems inevitable, but in the early days of the scandal, there was real public resistance to his removal.
Many more things are bothering America than Watergate.
I think they make a big fuss over nothing.
Nothing has been proven illegal about anything he's done, and I think he's on the right track.
Yeah, exactly. For a while, people thought that Watergate, the scandal that we now use as shorthand for every political scandal, didn't matter. And that's shocking to watch, although, to be fair, in the 1970s, they also thought that shag carpeting was attractive and that Liberace just hadn't met the right girl yet. That decade had a lot to learn. But a Nixon outcome is not the only model. Many Democrats worry that things could instead end up like the Clinton impeachment, where the public wasn't really on board with impeachment from the beginning, and they never got on board. And not only did Clinton survive, his party gained seats in that year's midterms. That is what Democrats are scared about here, that impeachment could end up strengthening Trump for 2020. Although for any Democrats whose main concern is that pursuing impeachment could be the reason they lose in 2020, please relax. It is just one of many ways that Democrats could lose. Maybe Trump is caught on tape saying the N-word, but then 2 weeks later, Elizabeth Warren accidentally calls a veteran a veterinarian, and people get twice as angry about that. There's so many ways that this could go wrong. Just this week, he was asked about Don Jr.'s failure to alert the FBI when Russia offered them intel during the campaign, and his response was appalling.
Should he have gone to the FBI when he got that email?
Okay, let's put yourself in a position. You're a congressman. Somebody comes up and says, hey, I have information on your opponent. Do you call the FBI? I don't think.
Coming from
I'll tell you
Russia,
what,
you do?
I've seen a lot of things over my life. I don't think in my whole life I've ever called the FBI. In my whole life. You don't call the FBI. This is somebody that said, we have information on your opponent. Oh, let me call the FBI. Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
The FBI director says that's what should happen.
The FBI director is wrong.
Oh my God, this dude is unbelievable. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, when I saw this clip, I literally had to take a break because my head literally fell off my body, and then I had to go get duct tape and Gorilla Glue and make sure it somehow stayed back on. This man is insane.
Comes up and says, hey, I have information on your opponent. Do you call the FBI? I don't think.
Coming from
I'll tell you
Russia,
what,
you do.
I've seen a lot of things over my life. I don't think in my whole life I've ever called the FBI. In my whole life. You don't call the FBI. This is somebody that said, we have information on your opponent. Oh, let me call the FBI. Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
The FBI director says that's what should happen.
The FBI director is wrong.
Okay, there is so much in there. Let's break this down into 3 pieces. First, I don't think in my whole life I've ever called the FBI is a truly insane thing to say. No, people usually don't call the FBI, except when they're in a very specific situation that clearly requires them to do so. That's kind of how that works. I have never called Emilio Estevez. As a general rule, in one's everyday life, one does not call Emilio Estevez. But if I found a wallet on the street with Emilio Estevez's driver's license and contact information, I'd fucking call Emilio Estevez because that's what the situation requires. Okay, so second, let's take his give me a break, life doesn't work that way. It is genuinely fascinating to watch Trump project his own immoral awfulness onto the rest of humanity. Oh, so you see a baby stroller about to roll down a hill and what, you're gonna stop it? Give me a break, life doesn't work out that way. You stand there, you watch and you laugh. Everybody knows this and everybody agrees. Give me a break. Give me a break on that one. And finally, the FBI director is wrong. He's basically saying laws are a matter of opinion and you can trust your Uncle Don on this one. But of course that is not true, which is why the head of the Federal Election Commission put out a statement reminding all of us that it is illegal to accept anything of value from a foreign country in connection with the US election. And when foreign governments seek to influence American politics, it is always to advance their own interests, not America's. She tweeted that statement out with a note reading, I would not have thought that I needed to say this. And that kind of sums up where we are in the Trump presidency. All of those things we wouldn't have thought we needed to say, we need to fucking say them now. And as if that weren't bad enough, Trump then engaged in a little thought experiment of what he would do if he found himself in the same situation all over again.
Your campaign this time around, if foreigners, if Russia, if China, if someone else offers you information on an opponent, should they accept it or should they call the FBI?
I think maybe you do both. I think you might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening. If somebody called from a country, Norway, we have information on your opponent. Oh, I think I'd want to hear it.
You want that kind of interference in our elections?
It's not an interference. They have information. I think I'd take it.
Okay. First of all, let's address that Norway. It continues to be telling that when Trump tries to search his brain for the best country he can imagine, it goes directly to the whitest country he can imagine. But more importantly, that is the president openly inviting foreign interference in our elections again. And I know that we've all become numb to Trump by this point, but moments like that really shock you out of your stupor and make you think, oh, hang on, that guy's got to be impeached. We've got to impeach him. And look, should Democrats let House investigations play out a little further before they make a move? Maybe. There's an argument for that. That strategy certainly paid off during Watergate, but later can't mean never, because the case for inaction here is starting to get pretty weak. And yes, public opinion is currently against an impeachment inquiry, but if Democrats think opening an inquiry is genuinely the right thing to do, then it's then incumbent upon them to work to change that opinion. I know it's easy to be defeatist here because nothing has seemingly reined Trump in so far, but I will say this. Every arsehole succeeds until finally they don't. Again, 18 months before he resigned, Nixon had a sky-high approval rating of 67%. Harvey Weinstein was winning Oscars until one day he definitely wasn't. James Holzhauer was stealing all of Alex Trebek's money until someone finally put a stop to it.
Hey everybody, real quick, the senior advisor to the president is a white nationalist, but that's not what we're going to talk about, even though that's all anyone should be talking about. Here's some more news. We got a bum prez, y'all. A real cauldron of cold diarrhea in president form. And now a bunch of people just sat around in a big fancy room talking to other people to determine if we can perhaps not have him as the president anymore. Because we got a bad one, folks. A super duper fart noggin of a POTUS he is. And you know what? Before we get jabbering about laws and junk, allow me to be the first to say that I do very much wish we could undo the 2016 election. The thing that Republicans are accusing Democrats of doing with this impeachment. I sincerely wish that 1/5 of the country didn't get duped into voting for a sorta rich, racist steak peddler with absolutely no experience or even respect for our military, who very clearly had only his own personal gain in mind. He wasn't even in the best Home Alone. I wish that the candidate who actually got the most votes was the person who won, even though that candidate wasn't very good either, but less bad. I would totes undo the election, like with a time machine or whatever that butterfly effect film did. If only to maybe prevent a bunch of kids getting separated from their parents and thrown in cages and then lost, and the number lost keeps getting revealed to be higher, or the senior advisor to the president to become not a white nationalist. I think it's in the best interest of this country to not have the president we have, despite whether or not he did something illegal. Luckily, it sure seems like he has done many illegal things and should be impeached for those things. But since our government is designed like a cascading clown show, there is a whole cluster of people whose job it is to pretend like that isn't true and obstruct the process as much as possible. And their sweaty diarrhea has leaked down to regular folk who happen to be like-minded politically, as if their entire ideology is hinged on whether or not an obvious grifter did obviously bad things. And hey, the holidays are coming! Thanksgiving and Hanukkah and New Year's and I think there's one more in there too. And that means you all get to go home, sit at a table or table-like object, and try to debate with your relatives about basic reality. Reality that is being denied by a whole lot of people who sure don't want to admit that their president did some crimes. Obvious crimes. Because he thinks he can act like the same greasy business fink he always was while also holding the highest office in the world. He's very bad at this. So I thought I'd help you all out a little bit, not only by going through the evidence of the impeachment inquiry, but calling out all of the blatant diarrhea being slopped around to distract from the actual facts of the impeachment inquiry. No better place to start than the Constitution. Can I get a Constitution, please? Get it out here. Let's get it. You didn't get the original Constitution for me to roll out here and examine? Okay. Let's look at this copy on the screen. Okay, zoom in on Article 2, Section 4. Right there, where some honky scribbled that the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That's going to be our standard for impeachment. Now, you might be wondering, hey there, sex buns! Just what exactly is high crimes and misdemeanors? Some kind of fancy movie made by a pervert? To which I would say, yes. But also, totally not relevant for what we need to talk about. Because the word I'd actually like to focus on, written right there in the Constitution, I so desperately want to own, is bribery. And just because people are going to act like obtuse idiots, here is a legal definition of that word, which specifically says demonstrating a quid pro quo relationship in which the recipient directly alters behavior in exchange for the gift. Quid pro quo being Latin for the phrase something for something. I give you a thing you want, and in exchange, you give me a thing I want. In legal code Dumb S201, it is described as when a public official or person selected to be a public official directly or indirectly corruptly demands, seeks, receives, accepts, or agrees to receive or accept anything of value personally or for any other person or entity in return for being influenced in the performance of any official act. And just because people are going to continue to act like obtuse idiots, that's why we're talking about a personal quid pro quo. Because the president absolutely can, on an official level, withhold aid in exchange for a country doing a thing, like when Jimmy Carter withheld aid from Chile, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Uganda for human rights abuses. What they can't do is use the office to bribe other countries for their personal gain. That's what we're very clearly talking about. The accusation that Donald Trump ordered aid to be withheld from Ukraine unless they announced an unwarranted investigation into one of his political rivals for his personal gain in the next election. That's the goalpost being clearly set, not just by myself, but by the GOP and conservatives.
Are you open-minded if more comes out that you could support impeachment?
Sure. I mean, show me something that is a crime. If you could show me that, Trump actually was engaging in a quid pro quo outside the phone call, that would be very disturbing.
Not that we need their approval, but that's the now commonly agreed on standard, even though it doesn't really have to be, and the president is doing all kinds of other crimes we could also be investigating. If there was evidence of a quid pro quo outside of Trump's phone call to the Ukrainian president, which did have evidence of a quid pro quo, but whatever, we'll get to that later, if there's evidence of that, well then that's very disturbing. To quote a very smart boy, no quid pro quo, no impeachment, no moving goalposts. Are we all clear? A personal quid pro quo, as in bribery, is constitutionally described as an impeachable offense. Not the only impeachable offense, but the one that these impeachment inquiries are mostly about. Also, just to get out of the way, all that Biden, Burisma, Ukraine stuff, what the president claims to have been looking for, was investigated a bunch, and they found no evidence of corruption specific to the vice president and his son.
The pervasive and long-standing problem of corruption in Ukraine included exposure to a situation involving the energy company Burisma. The primary concern of the U.S. government since 2014 was Burisma's owner, Mykola Zlochevsky, whose frozen assets abroad we had attempted to recover on Ukraine's behalf. In early 2015, I raised questions with the Deputy Prosecutor General about why the investigation of Mr. Zlochevsky had been terminated, based on our belief that prosecutors had accepted bribes to close the case. Later, I became aware that Hunter Biden was on the board of Burisma. Soon after that, in a briefing call with the National Security Staff of the Office of the Vice President in February of 2015, I raised my concern that Hunter Biden's status as a board member could create the perception of a conflict of interests. Let me be clear, however, I did not witness any effort by any U.S. official to shield Burisma from scrutiny. In fact, I and other U.S. officials consistently advocated reinstituting a scuttled investigation of Zlochevsky, Burisma's founder, as well as holding the corrupt prosecutors who closed the case to account.
Now, don't get this news dude wrong, all right? Burisma is corrupt as shit. Nor am I saying that Biden's son should be involved in international business, and in fact am, right this second, saying they shouldn't be. This goes for all politicians. No sons! Nor should their sons-in-law or daughters be doing that sort of stuff. It's a bad thing, all around. And perhaps the president should look into all the other instances of sons or daughters or sons-in-law, having business dealings overseas. Maybe he should do that. If he's so concerned about this kind of corruption as he claims. But this isn't about those things, but rather whether or not Trump had a good reason to specifically go after Biden, used proper channels to do that, and if he used federal aid to bribe a country into specifically going after his political rival. So let's get to those inquiries, except hold the f*** up! Let's not! Because the GOP has also questioned the legitimacy of the inquiries themselves for reasons that I'm sure are very serious reasons that we now have to address. There was the demand for a House vote, something that wasn't necessary to begin the inquiry, but whatever, they did one anyway, so let's move on. Then Trump claimed that the inquiry was constitutionally invalid because they denied him the ability to cross-examine witnesses or call witnesses. But that's not true, as neither the Constitution nor House rules require that, and in the past, presidential rebuttals came at the end of the process. He does, however, get the right to cross-examine and rebut witnesses once this gets to the Senate. This is probably stuff that the president and his toadies should know, right? Like law stuff. It would be weird if we elected a president who didn't know these kinds of things. And then we get to Matt Gaetz, guy with a face and U.S. representative for Florida. Now, I'm not going to give Gaetz that much attention because it's clearly what he wants. But I simply must talk about the time when he and a group of House Republicans valiantly stormed into the impeachment inquiry, quite stupidly, and while breaching security to protest the idea that they weren't allowed in the room, that it was a shadowy and secret process designed to keep Republicans away, which is weird because of that group of sit-in Republicans claiming they weren't allowed in the inquiry. 13 of them were allowed in the inquiry. The Foreign Affairs Committee holding the inquiry has 103 members that are split evenly between Republicans and Democrats, something the House Republicans absolutely should know, which means that 13 of them chose not to attend the inquiry in order to pretend like they weren't invited to the inquiry, which they were absolutely invited to. In other words, they just lied. They lied to your face to pretend like the impeachment inquiry was corrupt in order to later discredit the results. Also, one of the people that was there was Steve King. Speaking of white nationalism, for earlier, he was there. I thought the GOP was like, no, he's the white nationalist. We don't want anything to do with him, but he was there anyway. I don't know, that's kind of weird. Anyway, Trump not only had knowledge of the sit-in, but supported it before it happened, and it's a little pathetic and obvious, and something a guilty person would do, and maybe illegal. And Gaetz is being used like some kind of instrument to carry out the president's wishes, like a tool. Sure is weird how, even though they are claiming the president is totally innocent, the GOP is putting all kinds of intimidation and obstruction tactics on the inquiry, demanding the media reveal the whistleblower's name, and trying to force him or her to appear in public and not just give written answers, even though Trump 100% will only give written answers, and then threatening to give up dirt on witnesses. Strange how the totally not guilty president is doing everything he can to scare away the people testifying about him. But despite all of this, the impeachment inquiry has continued because it's a completely legal and historically normal process, with witnesses who are extremely credible, mainly concerned about Ukraine, and very serious, even though some of them wear bow ties that look like a wacky scrotum. That's George Kent, a Harvard grad who can speak Ukrainian, Russian, and Thai, and also joined the State Department in 1992. He's considered an expert on the corruption in Ukraine. He was a senior anti-corruption coordinator in the State Department's European Bureau, and even has the bow tie in his official State Department biography. Another person giving testimony is Ambassador Bill Taylor, a career diplomat who has served both Republican and Democratic administrations. He graduated from West Point, served in the infantry for 6 years, and fought in the Vietnam War. He was nominated to be Ukraine's ambassador by George W. Bush in 2006. Before getting hired as deputy assistant to the president and senior director for Europe and Russia, Fiona Hill was an intelligence officer for both George W. Bush and Obama. These aren't liberal nut jobs. They aren't never-Trumpers, as Trump would call them. And in fact, one of the key witnesses is Ambassador Gordon Sondland, who is a longtime GOP donor who was appointed by Trump after he donated $1 million to Trump's inaugural committee. So it's kind of interesting that the moment he flipped during this inquiry, our president would say this.
Let me just tell you, I hardly know the gentleman.
So that's weird. Like something a bad crime president would say, you know? They are so credible that conservatives are having problems finding ways to make them uncredible. Like, this is probably the most damning headline Fox could come up with about Marie Yovanovitch, who served the U.S. Foreign Service in 1986 and has been an ambassador since the Bush administration. But the president said she's bad news. When Lieutenant Colonel Alexander S. Vindman came forward, the media was quick to point out that he is an extremely respected soldier and scholar who fled to Ukraine at age 3 and went to Harvard, became a decorated officer in the United States Army, and then an expert on Ukraine for the White House's National Security Council. He's like everything the GOP fantasizes about when they think of immigrants assimilating to America. Gee, I wonder what detail Fox News focused on.
Here we have a U.S. national security official who is advising Ukraine while working inside the White House apparently against the president's interest, and usually they spoke in English. Isn't that kind of an interesting angle on this story?
I find that astounding, and some people might call that espionage.
Yes, some might call a Ukrainian immigrant spending his life loyally working for the U.S. government with a spotless record espionage. That some being people who are liars. And oh heck, maybe even xenophobic ones. So yeah, they got nothing. And for this reason, the main focus has been on the whistleblower, despite that the whistleblower has now been joined by a bunch of credible people backing them up.
Only chairmanship knows who the whistleblower is. We don't. We will never get the chance. We will never get the chance to see the whistleblower raise his right hand, swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. We'll never get that chance. More importantly, the American people won't get that chance. This anonymous so-called whistleblower with no firsthand knowledge, who's biased against the president, who worked with Joe Biden, who is the reason we're all sitting here today, will never get a chance to question that individual.
Yeah! How dare that lefty, communist whistleblower with bias against the president that we know literally nothing about? How dare they? It doesn't matter how many other people you get to confirm the president's crimes because that one whistleblower and their bias that we assume they have. Hey, quick side note. So that clip, you might have noticed, has a Daily Caller logo on the top. And I wanted to use that specific video because it's a part of the Daily Caller's 15-minute long recap video that completely cuts out nearly all of the actual testimony and focuses only on the parts where the GOP kinda sounds good. Like the Daily Caller, a site that calls itself news, that Facebook calls news, has a recap of the impeachment inquiry that cuts out nearly all of the actual inquiry. The article that came with it is, no joke, 250 words long. That's their coverage by someone calling themselves a reporter. So great work, Daily Caller founder Tasker Coruscant. But can you blame them? Like, if you were a partisan propaganda organization pretending to be the news and had to cover a story that was largely damning for your side, you kind of just have to pretend it's not happening. And much more on that later. But for the moment, let's actually stop and look at what has been said by these witnesses. No more teasing, all right? Let's get fully fisted by the truth. And as implied by the fisting, well, it's going to be a lot to take in. No doubt more and more revelations will show up along in the future, but also like the fisting, well, a little goes a long way. And so we already have a pretty damning timeline so far. So let's do it! Fist away! On April 21st, Volodymyr Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine, and according to EU Ambassador Gordon Sondland's testimony, he and several others later met with President Trump to discuss Ukraine. This was on May 23rd and included Special Envoy to Ukraine Kurt Volker, Rick Perry, and Senator Ron Johnson. This is also backed up by Kurt Volker's testimony, all in the transcript. And I can't in good conscience mention Rick Perry without checking in on what the president thinks of Rick Perry.
Rick Perry, watch him. He's a comer.
During that meeting with the comer and other people, and according to both Sondland and Volker, Trump showed very little actual interest in Ukraine and instructed them to talk to Rudy Giuliani, a person who, and this is true, is not a government employee, nor an expert on Ukraine, nor a person with experience being an ambassador or a diplomat, but rather the president's personal lawyer who, during this same time, was taking trips to Ukraine specifically to investigate Hunter Biden for political reasons. To quote Giuliani at the time of his trip, "I'm asking them to do an investigation that they're doing already and that other people are telling them to stop, and I'm going to give them reasons why they shouldn't stop it because that information will be very, very helpful to my client." Give them reasons. And now, according to multiple witnesses, it turns out the president was referring U.S. ambassadors and envoys to Giuliani, a not government official specifically tasked with going after his political rival to consult on Ukraine. The same Giuliani who hired Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman to go to Ukraine and find Ukrainians who were willing to make claims against the Bidens for his client, the president. Only for those two guys to get caught trying to leave the country after violating campaign finance laws connected to their time in, Ukraine. A place Giuliani told them to go to. Giuliani, the president's lawyer, who once said, "I don't do anything that involves my client without speaking to my client." None of this is hearsay. I'm just saying things that happened. Hey, look at this picture of the president standing next to those crime guys I just mentioned. So what were those crime guys up to anyway? Well, it turns out that they were making hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal campaign donations, while disguising where the money was coming from, in order to specifically push the firing of Ambassador Marie L. Yovanovitch, a woman that the president has and still continues to smear on Twitter. So what did Yovanovitch do wrong? Well, back in March, Marie gave a speech before the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, where she called out Ukraine for backsliding on corruption. And before this had made a lot of enemies in the country due to her criticism. And it turns out that Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, those crime guys who worked for the president's lawyer, well, a lot of their associates didn't like her. And so the crime guys were making donations to US officials in the hope they would push her out. And they got their wish after donating to Congressman Pete Sessions. On May 9th, Parnas posted a photo of himself in Sessions' office the same day that Greasy Pete wrote a letter to U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo claiming that Yovanovitch had made disparaging remarks against Trump. Meanwhile, Ukraine's then top prosecutor Yuri Lutsenko floated a conspiracy theory that Yovanovitch had secretly helped the Clinton campaign. This was based on literally nothing, and was since recanted by Lutsenko himself. Didn't matter because Trump, great brain, had been successfully tricked into the conspiracy theory, as he is wont to do, and began to attack Yovanovitch. It didn't help that many of the people who didn't like her in Ukraine also happened to be the same people that Giuliani was tapping for dirt on Biden. And this is all according to testimonies and indictments. So while you may have seen a lot of people wonder why Yovanovitch is even involved, this is mostly the reason. She was collateral damage, her ousting a sort of side deal made between Giuliani and the people in Ukraine he was working with to find Biden stuff. For the president, of course. These people apparently had a problem with Yovanovitch, an extremely serious ambassador who was focused on corruption. I wonder what type of people would have a problem with that. Anywho, according to Yovanovitch's testimony, she was called at 1 a.m. and told to get on the first plane out of Ukraine and back to Washington due to concerns for her security. Her dismissal then caused Michael McKinley, a 30-year ambassador and then senior advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, to quit, citing a continuous effort by Trump and Giuliani to sideline and silence career diplomats working on Ukraine. Wowee, that's a lot of sketchy-ass stuff I just said, huh? But focus, Cody, all right? We're looking for bribery, not the other clearly impeachable crimes. The key part so far is when the president told U.S. ambassadors to work with his personal crime lawyer on Ukraine. Next up is July 10th, when, according to testimony by Senior Director for Europe and Russia on the National Security Council, Fiona Hill, there was a White House meeting with the then National Security Advisor John Bolton and 2 Ukrainian officials who were trying to get a meeting between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. In that meeting, Ambassador Gordon Sondland, the guy who is very much Team Trump and also a wealthy hotel owner who maybe shouldn't be involved in the government, let it be known that he had an agreement with Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney that if the Ukrainians agreed to investigate Hunter Biden, they could get a meeting with the president. According to Hill, everyone in the room got real uncomfortable because Sondland hadn't at all discussed this officially and was basically just throwing it out there. So Bolton stops the meeting and they call it a day. Then at a follow-up meeting, Sondland does it again, and this time Hill halts the meeting again and asks the Ukrainian officials to leave the room. And according to her testimony, she then tried to explain to Sondland why he couldn't keep doing that, specifically telling him that they couldn't make any commitments without going through the proper procedures. To which Sondland then brought up Giuliani as his defense. You know, the president's personal lawyer, who I'm pretty sure shouldn't at all be involved in matters of diplomacy, as he wasn't even named as a special envoy. Later, she and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander S. Vindman decide to report the sketchy as meeting to John A. Eisenberg, the chief legal advisor to the National Security Council. And before they do it, Bolton asks Hill to, quote, "Go and tell Eisenberg that I am not part of whatever drug deal Sondland and Mulvaney are cooking up on this." So here we see a clash where the acting White House chief of staff teamed with an ambassador with close support of Trump to set up unofficial and weird meetings under the condition that Ukraine go forward with these investigations, and members of the National Security Council were getting very uncomfortable with that. Then came the time that Trump withheld aid from Ukraine. According to testimony by Laura Cooper, a top Pentagon official overseeing Ukraine, this happened near the end of July. You know what else happened near the end of July? The date July 25th, which is also when Trump made that phone call to President Zelensky. According to the transcripts, that aren't actually verbatim transcripts, according to the transcript itself that Trump is insisting we all read, the Ukrainian president brings up his desire to buy more javelins from the US for defense purposes, to which Trump responds, "I would like you to do us a favor, though," before bringing up an investigation into CrowdStrike, an entirely different tangent that I guess we need to talk about right now. CrowdStrike is the cybersecurity technology company that the DNC hired to analyze their email hack 5 months before the 2016 election, the one that linked Russia to our elections, a thing they totally messed with. CrowdStrike is the one who figured out that Russian agents had broken into the DNC's network and stolen emails, the evidence of which was later used by Mueller to indict 12 members of Russia's military, as laid out in his report that includes at least 10 other impeachable instances of obstruction of justice. But anyway, for that reason, there's been a conspiracy theory that CrowdStrike, a company that has also worked with the GOP when they had hacking issues, withheld knowledge that it was actually Ukraine that hacked the DNC and blamed it on Russia, something that has zero evidence behind it and would be a pretty random thing for a nonpartisan company to decide to do. This was being pushed by Roger Stone, a man known for lying and for having a back tattoo commemorating his friendship with another crime president who was just found guilty of witness tampering and lying to Congress. Stone, if you forgot, was an advisor to Trump's 2016 presidential campaign who was caught establishing a back channel with those Russian hackers and WikiLeaks to dig up dirt on Trump's election rival, which sure seems like a thing that keeps on happening, huh? And it just so happens that Mueller's testimony was a day before Trump called Zelensky, which is why, in the transcript the president wants us to read, Trump specifically asks Ukraine to look into it because he wants, quote, "that whole nonsense ended with a very poor performance by a man named Robert Mueller." This is the transcript the president wanted us to read, and it involves the Ukraine president bringing up purchasing weapons from the US before the president responds with, "I would like you to do us a favor, though," as in conditional to purchasing weapons, and that favor is for him to investigate a private company responsible for the investigations against him. They wanted us to read this, including the other part where Trump says, "The other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son," and so on. During the same time, it became very clear to everyone that there was a quid pro quo between Trump and Zelensky. To quote Ambassador Bill Taylor during his testimony, "That was my clear understanding. Security assistance money would not come until the president committed to pursue the investigation." Taylor would later text Sondland and say, "I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign." On August 9th, we also have a text exchange provided by former U.S. Special Envoy Kurt Volker between himself and Sondland arranging a White House meeting and statement from the Ukrainian president where Sondland remarks, "POTUS really wants the deliverable," and they begin drafting a statement for the event. Then 3 days later, we got the first whistleblower complaint about the July 25th call, which begins to make its way through Congress and seemingly causes Trump's advisors to try to convince him to release the aid, which he still doesn't do. He is now withholding the aid despite people begging him to do it. The situation at this point was getting so alarming that the senior State Department official in charge of Ukraine, George Kent, wrote up a memo specifically addressing it, expressing concerns that there were people like Giuliani, pushing communication with Ukraine and not going through any formal policy process while doing it. The implication there is that Trump was basically undermining the official channels, working a different deal that was under the table through his personal lawyer, who he had directed his ambassadors to work with. Then, on September 1st, is when, according to testimony, we get a very explicit mention of a quid pro quo, as William Taylor recalled that during an event in Warsaw commemorating World War II, Zelensky flat out asked Vice President Mike Pence about security cooperation. Pence deflected and said he'd talk to Trump about it. Taylor testified that he then spoke to National Security Council advisor Tim Morrison about this, and Morrison told him that Sondland told one of Zelensky's top aides that, quote, "security assistance money would not come until President Zelensky committed to pursue the Burisma investigation." Burisma being the company Hunter Biden worked for. While that sounds like a game of telephone or secondhand information, both Tim Morrison and Sondland would then corroborate this with their testimonies as well. According to Sondland himself, he explicitly told Zelensky's people that Ukraine wasn't going to get aid unless he investigated Biden. Meanwhile, 13 Ukrainian soldiers would die during this span of withheld aid. Fun fact. Having no choice in the matter, Zelensky then prepared to go on CNN to talk to Fareed Zakaria and announce publicly that he was going to investigate Biden like Trump wanted. But before he could do that, the story broke about the whistleblower, causing the White House to release the aid. And because they released the money, Zelensky quickly canceled the CNN appearance.
And then I was in Kiev on September 12th and 13th, and I met with him, which often happens. They want to, suss you out and make sure that they feel comfortable. And we had a very nice conversation, no inkling of any of this. And then we sort of had a date set. They'd essentially committed to it. And I think the Washington Post breaks the story about the whistleblower and the whole thing, suddenly radio silence from their side.
That's when the aid was released, right?
That was when the aid was released. And then I think the aid was released, the Post story breaks. The Trump administration, I think I have this right, the story breaks. I think it was the Post. The aid is quickly released. And then the interview is essentially canceled. So the way I look at it was, the aid is released, so that's the end of the quid. And then the interview is canceled. That's the end of the quo.
Did you catch all of that? Zelensky's aide was told that he wasn't going to get the money unless he announced an investigation into Biden, despite there being no reason for that investigation beyond the fact that Biden was Trump's political rival. And Zelensky was so clearly only doing that for the aid that when it was finally released, he canceled the announcement. Because he didn't actually care about investigating Biden, he was doing something to get something. And then once he got his something, canceled the something he was supposed to give in order to get the something. And everything I just told you is from these inquiries, corroborated by various advisors and ambassadors with varying loyalty to Trump and for some, many years of bipartisan service. None of this is from the mysterious whistleblower, and it all very clearly points to Trump trying to set up a bribe, which is definitely grounds for impeachment under the Constitution. There's no wiggle room there. The idea that Ukraine didn't know about the quid pro quo, not that it would legally matter, is not true. And everything I described here is just the thing that happened according to these very credible witnesses and backed up with text messages. Also, probably could have saved some time, but here's the fucking White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, just saying there was a quid pro quo.
Those were the driving factors. Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely, no question about that. But that's it, and that's why we held up the money. Now, there was a report.
So the demand for an investigation into the Democrats was part of the reason that he ordered to withhold funding to Ukraine.
The look back to what happened in 2016 certainly was part of the thing that he was worried about in corruption with that nation. And that is absolutely appropriate.
Withholding the funding.
Yeah.
Could have maybe led with that, Cody. But whatever. There it is. That quid pro quo that Lindsey Graham was talking about. Shall we now check in with him to hear his thoughts? No doubt it's some kind of grand revelation that he's been led astray by the president, right?
Do you plan on reading these transcripts that were released?
No.
Oh, okay. So all those transcripts I just cited about how there was totally a quid pro quo, Lindsey isn't going to read them. To his credit, that's a pretty easy way to avoid taking responsibility, by just not doing his job. I honestly didn't realize that was an option, but I guess it is. Like, that's seriously how the GOP is handling this, by just ignoring it. Or in Trump's case, claiming he's not going to watch the hearing and then tweeting about that hearing he's not watching. It's just very transparent. Remember Ben Shapiro's no quid pro quo, no impeachment, no moving goalpost tweets before the hearing? Yeah, you remember that. The whole thing where he wasn't going to move any goalposts. Let's check in with that.
The White House should stop saying there was no quid pro quo. There was a quid pro quo. The question is whether it was a corrupt quid pro quo, as I've been saying for weeks.
Okay, Ben. So there was a quid pro quo, as you have been saying for weeks. And I guess we'll just have to trust you there because of how truthful you are. And there's no possible way to look into the past and see what you've said. Special Ben. we could probably just end the video here, but then we get to miss the fun part. Because, as I believe I've explained, there is a lot of very damning and undeniable witness evidence from extremely credible sources pointing to an impeachable offense. And normal people should, at this point, be able to recognize that. But folks like Ben and the GOP keep on pushing those goalposts and trying to explain that sure, there was a quid pro quo, but not a corrupt one. And in fact, these things happen all the time.
And that was the legality of the issue.
But to be clear, what you just described is a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happened as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy. And I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy.
Yeah! Get over it, bro! Investigating corruption is so 2018. Also, buy these shirts. These official shirts from Trump. His branded argument about how quid pro quos are no big deal. A thing he also definitely didn't do, according to him. See, that's the real fun part. Because while they are still trying to discredit the idea that there even was a quid pro quo, they're also simultaneously pushing the idea that it would have been totally normal if it happened. Like saying, hey man, I didn't shit in the dressing room with this JCPenney, but if I did, that wouldn't be the end of the world, you know? Like, people shit places all the time. Why not a dressing room? It's the same size of a bathroom. It happens all the time. And now we have to backtrack all over again, because at the start of this, I pointed out that there are quid pro quos the government legally engages in with other governments, which was never the accusation here. This is an accusation about a personal quid pro quo. And so by trying to point that out as a defense of Trump is a way to purposefully bog down the conversation, especially when, as clearly stated in the evidence, these ambassadors and diplomats were working with Trump's personal lawyer and were specifically worried about how they weren't dealing with Ukraine through proper channels and procedures. Saying, yeah, but the US makes deals all the time is missing the entire point of what the accusations are. It's being purposefully stupid, or just regular stupid, but probably purposefully stupid. And again, they are doing this all while trying to also claim it never happened. Here's U.S. Representative Jim Jordan grilling William Taylor and claiming that since Zelensky didn't announce the investigation into Biden, that means there was no quid pro quo.
My clear understanding was they weren't going to get the money until President Zelensky committed to pursue the investigations. Now, with all due respect, Ambassador, your clear understanding was obviously wrong because it didn't happen. President Zelensky didn't announce he was going to investigate Burisma or the Bidens. He didn't do a press conference and say, I'm going to investigate the Bidens, we're going to investigate Burisma. He didn't tweet about it, and you just told the ranking member he didn't do the CNN interview and announce he's going to investigate Burisma or the Bidens.
Okay, so despite all the evidence and the fact that Zelensky was absolutely going to announce the investigation into Biden before the money was released after public scrutiny, that's going to be Jim Jordan's stupid opinion on the situation, and he's totally entitled to that. Now here he is speaking after the same damn hearing.
Ukraine's one, as Ernst & Young said, one of the 3 most corrupt countries on the planet. President Trump and our administration, or his administration, was checking him out. And guess what? After Vice President Pence visited with Mr. Zelensky, after Senators bipartisan, Senators Johnson and Murphy visited with President Zelensky, 6 days later the aid is released because they all became convinced this is a guy worth sending the hard-earned tax dollars of the American people to.
Okay, so it was all a test of corruption. He was like an undercover cop buying drugs to bust the dealer. So here's a question then. If Zelensky didn't announce they were looking into Biden, like you, Jim Jordan, said didn't happen during the hearing, then how did they pass this corruption test you are now saying did happen? What did Zelensky do to convince Trump, famous anti-corruption president, that he was on the level? Because the only thing Zelensky was asked to investigate was Biden, which Zelensky didn't do because he got the aid. So did this never happen, or did it actually happen and was part of a corruption test? Which is it, Jord? Which lie do you want to tell? Because you can't tell both lies. You just can't, little buddy. Or I guess you can, because you did. So this is where we're at. There's a ton of damning evidence showing that the President of the United States instructed various ambassadors and officials to work with his personal lawyer to make a deal with another country exchanging aid for a personal favor. And because it's so clear, the GOP is going to spend the inquiry ranting and tap-dancing conspiracies and just flat out lying and confusing the subject. They have no other option. Besides acting in the interest of the people and not themselves. And don't get me wrong here. Democrats, possibly the lesser of two evils, are also using this inquiry to preach and make big dumb speeches and use these very serious witnesses to grandstand. It's a lot of filling time sprinkled with extremely important information hidden in hours of insufferable bullshit.
My colleagues, a couple of my colleagues referenced the conversation, the hot mic conversation between President Obama and President Medvedev. That was in 2012. There's a suggestion that he was saying he was going to go easy on Russia over the invasion of Ukraine, but that invasion took place 2 years after that conversation. You don't have any reason to believe that President Obama was referring to going easy on Russia for an invasion that hadn't happened yet, do you?
Mr. Chairman, I have no knowledge of what was in...
It was more or less a rhetorical question.
Hey, maybe don't ask the very serious ambassador rhetorical questions to dunk on the Republicans, Shiffy. Dude isn't made of time. This is a test of the legislative branch as a whole, who is facing an executive branch that is very clearly corrupt. It's everything the Constitution talked about in terms of removing a president from office. Trump, who believes in very little, could have just as likely grifted his way into the Democratic Party. Like, it really shouldn't be about party lines, at least specifically when it comes to his crimes, which are very numerous and obvious. This really shouldn't be hard, and yet it is, because the system we designed here is broken. All of it. From the branches of our government to the terrible media coverage claiming that the inquiries are boring and dull and lacked pizzazz. No pizzazz? Did you not see the fucking bow tie? But the true heroes of the dipshit parade are, of course, conservative media, who are going to give us endless months of this.
You tune in, you're either sound asleep or you can't follow. He said, she said, she said, he said, he said. It's a bunch of gossip girls. It's not a legitimate inquiry.
So you want to stop the impeachment?
Again, it might just as easily have been Democrats, but Republicans and conservatives are on the slab here. They are most responsible for this mess, and so they are the ones being put to the test, and they're just failing the shit out of that test. Like, you know how I'm being super detailed and explaining the definition of stuff and whipping out the Constitution, or at least trying to? I'm not doing that to be a condescending chuckle dick. I'm doing it because I actually have to.
Okay, here's the problem. Yeah, of course, Nancy, it's in the Constitution. We can read, okay? President may be impeached for bribery, treason, or high crimes and misdemeanors. But even assuming the Democrats' strained and ridiculous interpretation of the facts, and I do not assume them, but just for the sake of their argument, attempted bribery isn't in the Constitution.
This is where we are at. And just in case your uncle whips out that gem on Thanksgiving or on... What's the other one? Starts with an X? Well, in case of that, here I'm just going to once again show you this link to the legal definition of bribery that specifies that seeking an exchange of value is also bribery. Do I have to play the Simpsons clip?
Convicted of a crime I didn't even commit. Ha! Attempted murder. Now, honestly, what is that? Do they give a Nobel Prize for attempted chemistry, do they?
This is just so embarrassing, and we still haven't hit the bottom.
Because life on Earth is bribery. You say, I want something from you, you give something to me. That's how the world works everywhere.
Ah, yeah. The president couldn't have done bribery because of how, like, when you think about it, man, like, everything's bribery on, like, a philosophical level. They're grotesque, desperate, and lying constantly about what's happening. The only play they have left is to fundamentally change the rules of reality. And we probably shouldn't forget that, you know? Like if in the future we get to decide which party gets to be in charge, we should remember the specific people who, when faced with a trial of integrity, put their partisan and personal interests over the people they're supposed to be serving. We should remember the television and social media hacks who claim to be warriors of logic, but bend over backwards to not change their minds. They shouldn't be allowed to influence this country because they are hurting us. It's just a suggestion. Also, P.S. There's a white nationalist in charge of our immigration policies right now, so maybe there shouldn't be. Just a little P and an S. Something to consider, you know?